It is 1943. A Canadian citizen sits in a concrete cell the size of a grave, somewhere beneath Damascus. He has committed no crime. He holds a Canadian passport, and the government that is supposed to protect him knows exactly where he is. Back home, his wife is making phone calls that no one answers, filing documents that disappear. And in Ottawa, officials are quietly looking the other way because it was Canadian intelligence that put him in that cell to begin with. No trial, no charges, no rescue. This is not a Cold War spy thriller. This happened. It is documented. It is one of 50 stories Canada buried so deep, most people never learned they existed. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Let us begin. Number 1. For over a century, the Canadian government operated a vast network of institutions known as residential schools, and the true scale of what happened inside those walls is something that most Canadians were never taught in any meaningful way. The system began formally in the 1880s when Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's government partnered with the Roman Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches to establish schools designed to take Indigenous children away from their families and communities, strip them of their languages, their cultural practices, their spiritual traditions, and everything that connected them to who they were. The policy was stated with remarkable openness by a man named Duncan Campbell Scott, who served as the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for many years and who oversaw the system at its largest extent. Scott wrote and spoke publicly about his goal of eliminating Indigenous culture entirely. Children as young as 3 and 4 years old were removed from their homes, sometimes with parental consent, obtained through coercion or deception, and sometimes by force. They were transported to schools that could be hundreds of miles away. Once there, speaking their language could result in having their mouths washed out with soap, or being beaten, or being locked in dark rooms for days at a time. The conditions in many schools were profoundly inadequate. Food was scarce and poor in quality. Heating was insufficient. Medical care was minimal. Disease spread easily, and tuberculosis claimed enormous numbers of children. An early government report by a physician named Peter Henderson Bryce, submitted in 1907, found death rates at some schools that were extraordinarily high and recommended immediate reforms. The government suppressed the report. Bryce spent the rest of his career being sidelined and eventually published the findings himself at his own expense in 1922, by which point most officials had moved on. The last federally funded residential school in Canada did not close until 1996. That is not a distant chapter of history. Many people alive today attended these schools as children. Many more are the children and grandchildren of survivors. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of what were believed to be hundreds of unmarked graves near former school sites, beginning with the Tk'emlúps te Secwepemc Nation in British Columbia. The discoveries were experienced by much of the non-Indigenous public as a revelation. For most Indigenous communities across the country, it was confirmation of what had always been known and always been said. Number 2. In the year 1755, the British colonial government, in what is now Nova Scotia, carried out one of the largest forced deportations in North American history, scattering a French-speaking people called the Acadians from the lands their families had farmed and built for over 100 years. The event is known in French as Le Grand Dérangement, which translates simply as the Great Upheaval, and it is one of the most consequential and least discussed episodes in the story of what would become Canada. The Acadians were descendants of French settlers who had arrived in the region as early as the 1600s. They had built sophisticated agricultural systems on the tidal marshes along the Bay of Fundy, using a network of dikes they constructed and maintained with great skill. They had cultivated relationships, often complex and sometimes warm, with the Mi'kmaq people of the region. They had, over generations, developed a distinct culture and identity that was neither entirely French nor entirely shaped by the colonial ambitions of any empire. The British had controlled Nova Scotia for several decades when Governor Charles Lawrence and his council, without explicit authorization from London, decided that the Acadian population could not be trusted in the event of renewed conflict with France. The Acadians had long maintained a position of armed neutrality, refusing to swear an unqualified oath of allegiance to the British Crown. Lawrence used this as justification to order their removal. In the autumn of 1755, British soldiers arrived at Acadian villages and churches where communities had been gathered under the pretense of receiving official announcements. They were informed that their lands, their homes, their livestock, and nearly all of their possessions were forfeit to the Crown, and that they were to be placed on ships and dispersed to British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. Families were separated in the chaos. Ships were overcrowded and disease-ridden. Many Acadians died during the deportation itself, or in the years that followed, as they were scattered through communities that did not want them, in places where they did not speak the language, and where few were willing to offer help. Some were sent as far as France, a country most of them had never seen. Some were deported to what would become Louisiana, where their descendants would eventually develop the Cajun culture that still exists today. Number 3. Between 1885 and 1923, the Government of Canada imposed a discriminatory entry fee on Chinese immigrants that had no parallel for any other group arriving in the country, a policy rooted in racial anxiety and economic resentment that sent a clear message about who Canada believed belonged within its borders and who did not. The fee began at $50, which was already a substantial sum for a working person, and was raised to $100 in 1900 and then to $500 in 1903. That final figure was the equivalent of roughly 2 years of wages for a Chinese laborer. The context for this policy was the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, one of the foundational infrastructure projects of early Canada. Tens of thousands of Chinese workers had been recruited, primarily from Guangdong Province in southern China, to perform the most dangerous sections of the transcontinental railway's construction through the Rocky Mountains and the Fraser Canyon. They were paid considerably less than white workers for the same labor. They were given the most hazardous assignments, including the work of drilling and blasting through solid rock. An estimated 600 Chinese workers died during the construction of the railway, though the real number may have been considerably higher. When the railway was complete in 1885, the same government that had depended upon their labor turned around and implemented the Chinese head tax to prevent further immigration. The head tax devastated Chinese families who were already in Canada and wished to bring their wives and children to join them. Many men lived for years, and in some cases for decades, in a kind of enforced bachelor existence, separated from their families by a fee they could not afford. Communities called this separation the Bachelor Society, and it shaped Chinese Canadian culture in ways that are still being processed and understood. In 1923, the government went further still. The Chinese Immigration Act, which became known simply as the Chinese Exclusion Act, effectively banned almost all Chinese immigration entirely. The law remained in effect until 1947. The date of its passage, July 1st, 1923, which happened to fall on Dominion Day, Canada's national celebration, was referred to by Chinese Canadians as Humiliation Day for many years, and many refused to participate in national celebrations while the law remained on the books. Number 4. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, and within days, Canada joined the United States in declaring war against Japan. What followed in the weeks and months afterward for the roughly 22,000 people of Japanese descent living in British Columbia was one of the most sweeping violations of civil rights in Canadian history, carried out not in secrecy, but openly, with the full weight of federal law and the enthusiastic support of provincial and local politicians. The government of Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King invoked the War Measures Act to authorize the removal and detention of Japanese Canadians, the vast majority of whom were Canadian citizens or permanent residents who had lived in the country for years or decades. About 75% of those affected had been born in Canada or had lived there for most of their lives. They were given very short notice to gather a small number of personal belongings. Their homes, their businesses, their fishing boats, their farms, and their personal property were seized by the government. Much of it was sold at a fraction of its value without the owner's consent. Men of working age were separated from their families and sent to labor camps in the interior of British Columbia and in other provinces, where they worked under supervision building roads and performing other manual labor. Women, children, and the elderly were sent to interior towns that had been hastily designated as relocation centers, where conditions were often crowded and inadequate. Many families were split up for years. The last restrictions on Japanese Canadians were not lifted until 1949, 4 years after the end of the war. Even after the war ended, the government initially attempted to deport large numbers of Japanese Canadians to Japan, a country that many of them had never visited and where they had no family or connections. The deportation orders were only stopped after public outcry from civil liberties, organizations, and some members of parliament. Number 5. In the late spring of 1914, a Japanese steamship called the Komagata Maru arrived in the harbor at Vancouver, carrying 376 passengers, nearly all of them Sikhs from the Punjab region of India who were British subjects seeking to immigrate to Canada. What happened to them over the next 2 months represents one of the clearest illustrations of how Canadian immigration law was deliberately constructed to exclude people on the basis of race while maintaining the appearance of neutral, universal rules. Canada had at that time a regulation requiring that immigrants arrive by a continuous journey from their country of origin and that they possess a significant amount of money upon arrival. The continuous journey requirement had been designed specifically with Indian immigrants in mind, because there was no direct steamship service between India and Canada, meaning that virtually any Indian immigrant would have to stop somewhere along the way and would therefore technically violate the requirement. The passengers of the Komagata Maru had anticipated this and had chartered the ship specifically to make the voyage without stopping, satisfying the letter of the law. Canadian immigration officials and the courts, however, found other reasons to deny the passengers entry. They were kept on board the ship in the harbor for 2 months, while legal challenges wound through the courts. They were denied adequate food and water. Supporters in Vancouver tried to bring supplies to the ship, but were blocked by immigration authorities. The passengers watched from the deck as negotiations went nowhere, and the Canadian government showed every intention of waiting them out. In late July, the Canadian government sent a naval vessel, the HMCS Rainbow, to escort the Komagata Maru out of the harbor and back toward open water. The ship was eventually forced to return to India, arriving in Calcutta in September. There, British colonial authorities, having been informed that many of the passengers were suspected of being connected to anti-colonial political movements, attempted to arrest the returnees. A confrontation broke out on the docks that left 19 people dead, either killed by police or drowned while attempting to escape. Number 6. The Beothuk were the indigenous people of what is now the island of Newfoundland, and they were the first North American indigenous group to make sustained contact with European explorers and fishermen following the voyages of John Cabot in the late 15th century. Within roughly 300 years of that first contact, they were extinct. The last known Beothuk, a woman named Shanodithit, died in St. John's on the 6th of June, 1829. She was approximately 29 years old. With her death ended a culture, a language, and a people. And the manner in which that end came about is a history that Newfoundland and Canada have been slow to fully reckon with. The Beothuk had developed a sophisticated way of life centered on the seasonal movement between the coast, where they harvested the extraordinary marine resources of the island, and the interior forests, where they hunted caribou. They are known for their practice of using red ochre, a natural pigment, extensively in their ceremonies, on their bodies, and on their canoes and tools, which may be the origin of the term Red Indians, an early European description that was eventually applied broadly and inaccurately to indigenous peoples across the continent. European settlement of Newfoundland's coastline gradually displaced the Beothuk from the fishing grounds they had relied upon. As their access to coastal resources was cut off, they retreated further into the island's interior, where food was more scarce and survival more difficult. Tensions with European settlers escalated over the course of the 18th century. Beothuk were killed by settlers, by fishermen, and by trappers who viewed them as a threat or a nuisance. There are historical accounts of what can only be described as organized hunting of Beothuk by groups of settlers, and at least some of these accounts are supported by documentary evidence. No one was ever tried or convicted. Number 7. From the 1950s through the late 1980s, and in some documented cases into the 1990s, child welfare agencies across Canada, operating under federal and provincial authority, and often in partnership with church organizations, systematically removed Indigenous children from their families and placed them for adoption, or foster care with non-Indigenous families, most of them white, many of them in other provinces or other countries entirely. This policy, which was carried out on a massive scale and affected an estimated 20,000 children, is known as the 60 Scoop, though the name is somewhat misleading because the removals continued well beyond the 1960s. The workers who carried out these removals often did so with a genuine belief that they were acting in the best interest of the children. Many were operating within a framework that interpreted Indigenous poverty, which was itself a direct product of colonial policies, including the residential school system as evidence of parental neglect or incapacity. They saw the material conditions of reserve life, conditions produced by deliberate government underfunding and the destruction of traditional economies, as sufficient reason to remove children from their homes. What they did not see, or chose not to weigh, was the profound harm caused by severing children's connections to their communities, their cultures, their languages, and their identities. Children who were removed in this way often grew up with no knowledge of who they were or where they came from. Many were placed in families where they experienced discrimination, isolation, and sometimes abuse. When they became adults and sought to reconnect with their communities, they frequently found themselves in an agonizing in-between space, no longer fluent in their language, unfamiliar with their culture, and sometimes not fully accepted in either the Indigenous community they had been taken from or the non-Indigenous world in which they had been raised. The psychological consequences for many individuals were severe and lasting. Number 8. In the province of Quebec, during the long premiership of Maurice Duplessis, who governed from 1936 to 1939, and again from 1944 until his death in 1959, a fraud was perpetrated against thousands of orphaned or abandoned children that would not be fully exposed until decades after it occurred. The children who were victims of this fraud came to be known as the Duplessis orphans, and their story is one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of institutional care in Canada. During the post-war period, the Quebec government operated and funded a network of orphanages, many of them run by the Catholic Church. The federal government provided a per-day funding rate for the care of children, classified as mentally ill, that was significantly higher than the rate paid for the care of healthy orphans. Faced with this financial incentive, officials within the Quebec government and within church-administered institutions began reclassifying large numbers of perfectly healthy orphans as mentally deficient, psychologically disturbed, or otherwise psychiatrically impaired. Once relabeled, these children were transferred from orphanages to psychiatric institutions, which received the higher federal funding rate. The children who were reclassified in this way were then subjected to the conditions of psychiatric facilities. They were housed in wards with adults who had genuine mental illnesses. They received psychiatric treatments, including in some cases experimental procedures that they did not need and that were sometimes harmful. Their education was largely discontinued, as psychiatric institutions were not required to provide the schooling that orphanages were obligated to offer. Many of these children spent their formative years locked in institutions, their childhoods defined by confinement and medical procedures performed without their consent. Number 9. From 1928 to 1972, the province of Alberta operated a program of forced sterilization, authorized by legislation called the Sexual Sterilization Act. And in the nearly 45 years that this law was in effect, approximately 2,800 people were sterilized without their meaningful consent at the direction of a body called the Alberta Eugenics Board. The program was rooted in eugenics, the now discredited pseudoscientific ideology that believed human populations could and should be improved by selectively preventing the reproduction of people deemed undesirable, and it was enacted with the full support of the provincial government during a period when eugenics enjoyed mainstream scientific and political respectability across the Western world. The Eugenics Board had the authority to approve sterilizations for people who had been institutionalized in provincial facilities, including those diagnosed with mental illness or intellectual disability. The criteria applied by the board were often broad and inconsistently applied. Many of the people sterilized were not in fact cognitively impaired, but had ended up in institutional care due to poverty, unconventional behavior, or circumstances that were misread as signs of mental deficiency. A disproportionate number of those sterilized were indigenous, as were a disproportionate number of immigrants from Eastern Europe, whose cultural practices or language barriers made them appear different from the white and Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment that dominated Alberta's institutions at the time. People who were sterilized were often not told what was happening to them, or were told that the procedures were necessary for other medical reasons. Consent, where it was technically obtained, was frequently coerced, given by people who were under institutional authority and had no realistic ability to refuse. Some people did not learn that they had been sterilized until years later, when they attempted to have children and discovered they could not. Number 10. From the late 1950s through the early 1990s, the federal government of Canada systematically identified, monitored, and purged gay and lesbian employees from the public service, the military, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in a coordinated campaign that was driven by the belief that homosexual individuals were security risks who could be blackmailed by foreign agents into betraying state secrets. This program, which became known as the Purge, or more formally as the Fruit Machine Project, and later the Character Weakness Program, destroyed the careers and personal lives of an estimated 9,000 people over several decades, and it was not officially acknowledged by the government until 2017. The fruit machine, as it was called internally by those who knew of it, was an actual device commissioned by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and developed with assistance from researchers at Carleton University in Ottawa during the early 1960s. It was intended to identify homosexual individuals by measuring physiological responses to images, including pupil dilation, perspiration, and pulse rate when subjects were shown photographs. The machine was never proven to work reliably, and the project was eventually abandoned, but the broader campaign of surveillance and dismissal of gay and lesbian employees continued for decades after the fruit machine was set aside. People who were suspected of being homosexual were called in for interviews by RCMP officers and questioned in ways designed to extract admissions or to intimidate them into naming others. Those who were identified were dismissed from their positions, often without explanation and sometimes with the threat of criminal charges hanging over them, because homosexual acts between men remained a criminal offense in Canada until 1969. Their careers were ended. Their security clearances were revoked. Many left government service under clouds of manufactured shame and were unable to explain to friends or family why they had lost their jobs. Number 11. On the southern shore of the Bedford Basin in the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, there existed for most of the 20th century a black community called Africville, a neighborhood of roughly 400 people whose roots in that particular piece of land stretch back as far as the early 19th century, when black loyalists and later black refugees from the War of 1812 were granted land in the area. Africville was not a wealthy community. Its residents faced persistent discrimination in employment and housing throughout the city of Halifax, but it was home, and it held within it churches, families, a social fabric, and a sense of belonging that its residents valued deeply. The city of Halifax did not extend municipal services to Africville. For decades, the community had no running water, no sewage service, and no garbage collection. The city placed a slaughterhouse near the community's boundaries, and later a fertilizer plant, and eventually an open city dump. The lack of city services was not an oversight. It was a deliberate policy that reflected the racial attitudes of the city's leadership toward its black population. The residents of Africville paid taxes to the city of Halifax. They simply did not receive the services that those taxes were supposed to fund. Beginning in the 1960s, the city of Halifax, citing urban renewal goals and the need to clear land for development and infrastructure expansion, including a bridge, moved to demolish Africville entirely. The city's officials framed the demolition as an act of social improvement, an effort to provide Africville's residents with access to proper housing and city services that they had long been denied. Many residents were deeply opposed to the demolition and the loss of their community. Their opposition was largely ignored. Number 12. In May and June of 1939, a German ocean liner called the MS St. Louis arrived in the waters of the Caribbean and the eastern coast of North America carrying 937 passengers, almost all of them Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany and were desperately seeking a country that would accept them. They had visas and documentation. They were not asking for charity. They were asking for their lives. And every country they approached, including Canada, turned them away. The passengers of the St. Louis had left Hamburg with Cuban visas that by the time the ship arrived in Havana had been revoked by the Cuban government under pressure from domestic political forces. They waited in Havana harbor for weeks while negotiations conducted by Jewish relief organizations tried to find a solution. Cuba eventually allowed only a small number of passengers with additional documentation to disembark. The rest remained on the ship. The ship's captain, a man named Gustav Schroeder, who behaved with remarkable humanity throughout the ordeal, guided the vessel north toward the coast of Florida, hoping that the United States would grant entry to the refugees. American officials refused. The ship traveled along the Florida coast near enough that passengers could see the lights of Miami from the deck. The United States Coast Guard sent vessels to shadow the ship and ensure no one attempted to swim ashore. Canadian Jewish organizations appealed urgently to Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King's government to accept the refugees. Frederick Blair, the Director of Immigration for Canada, who was known within government circles for his openly anti-Semitic views, was adamant that the refugees should not be admitted. When asked how many Jewish refugees Canada would be willing to accept. In total, Blair reportedly gave an answer that has become one of the most damning quotations in Canadian history. None, he is said to have replied, is too many. Canada turned the ship away. Number 13. When the First World War began in August of 1914, Canada found itself in the peculiar position of having recently encouraged the immigration of hundreds of thousands of people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including many Ukrainians, many of them fleeing poverty and seeking a new life on the Canadian prairies, and then suddenly treating those same people as potential enemy aliens simply because their former homeland was now at war with Britain. The result was a program of internment and forced labor that most Canadians have never heard of, and that the Ukrainian-Canadian community spent decades trying to have officially acknowledged. Between 1914 and 1920, the Canadian government interned approximately 8,579 people under the War Measures Act in a network of 24 camps spread across the country. The majority of those interned were Ukrainian, though the camps also held people of German, Austro-Hungarian, and other Central and Eastern European origin. Most of those interned had committed no crime and posed no demonstrable threat to Canada. They were interned because of their national origin and because of the labor their internment could provide. Internees were put to work building roads and clearing land in national parks, including Banff and Jasper, where their labor contributed significantly to the development of infrastructure that Canadians would later enjoy as tourists. They worked under conditions that many of them described as harsh, with inadequate food, shelter, and clothing, and under military supervision that allowed for corporal punishment. At least 107 internees died in the camps, though the full number of deaths may have been higher. Beyond the camps themselves, thousands of Ukrainian Canadians who were not interned were required to report regularly to authorities and to carry identity documents. Many lost their jobs because employers were unwilling to hire people classified as enemy aliens. The community was marked by the experience for years afterward, and many families internalized a deep reluctance to draw attention to their Ukrainian heritage, a silence that lasted generations. Number 14. In May and June of 1919, the city of Winnipeg became the site of one of the largest and most dramatic labor uprisings in North American history, when over 30,000 workers walked off the job and brought the city to a near standstill for 6 weeks. The Winnipeg General Strike grew out of years of frustration over low wages, poor working conditions, and the refusal of employers and the government to recognize workers' right to collective bargaining. When it ended in violence at the hands of the government, it left wounds in the Canadian labor movement that took years to heal. The strike began in mid-May, when metal workers and building trades workers in the city walked out over disputes with their employers. Workers from almost every other sector of the city's economy, including telephone operators, telegraph operators, police officers, firefighters, and postal workers, walked out in sympathy. Essential services were partially maintained through committees organized by the strike committee itself, which demonstrated a level of organization and civic responsibility that alarmed the federal and provincial governments far more than chaos would have. The federal government, led by Prime Minister Robert Borden, viewed the strike with deep alarm and characterized it as a Bolshevist conspiracy inspired by the recent Russian Revolution. The city's business establishment and mainstream press adopted the same framing, portraying the strike's leaders as foreign radicals seeking to overthrow the established order, despite the fact that most of those leaders were British-born trade unionists with no connection to revolutionary politics. On June 17th, the federal government arrested 10 of the strike's leaders in pre-dawn raids. On June 21st, which became known as Bloody Saturday, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police charged on horseback into a crowd of strike supporters and returning veterans who had gathered for a peaceful parade. They fired into the crowd. 2 men were killed, dozens were injured. The strike collapsed within days. Number 15. During the Cold War, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police maintained a secret list of Canadians who were to be arrested and detained without trial in the event that a national emergency was declared, a program whose existence was not publicly known for decades, and whose scale, when it was finally revealed, shocked many people who had assumed that Canada's civil liberties were more robustly protected than they turned out to be. The program was known internally as Operation Pro-Funk, which stood for Prominent Functionaries of the Communist Party. The program was developed in the late 1940s and expanded through the 1950s and 1960s. At its peak, the RCMP's Pro-Funk list contained the names of approximately 16,000 Canadians who had been identified as communists or communist sympathizers, along with roughly 50,000 of their family members and associates. The people on this list had committed no crimes. They were on the list because of their political beliefs and associations. In the event of a declared national emergency, they were to be rounded up and held in detention camps, bypassing normal legal processes. The targets included not only Communist Party members, but a far wider circle of people who had at any point attended meetings, signed petitions, contributed money to organizations that the RCMP had deemed suspect, or associated with people who had done these things. The list was compiled through surveillance operations, informants, and the monitoring of mail and telephone communications. People on the list had no way of knowing they were there, no opportunity to challenge their inclusion, and no legal recourse. The program was not officially shut down until 1983. Its existence was first reported publicly by journalist Andrew Mitrovica in 2010, based on documents obtained through access to information, requests, and interviews with former RCMP officers who had worked on the program. The documents revealed that detention camps had been identified, that transportation logistics had been worked out, and that the program had been maintained in operational readiness for over 3 decades. Number 16. On the 5th of October, 1970, 2 cells of the Front de Libération du Québec, a militant separatist group that had spent the previous decade conducting bombing campaigns across Quebec, kidnapped a British trade commissioner named James Cross, and 5 days later kidnapped and murdered the provincial minister of labor, Pierre Laporte. The October crisis, as the period that followed became known, ended with the most sweeping invocation of emergency powers in Canadian peacetime history, and left behind a legacy of deeply contested questions about state power, civil liberties, and the limits of democratic government in moments of political violence. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's government, at the request of the Quebec provincial government and the City of Montreal, invoked the War Measures Act on October 16th. The act suspended civil liberties across the entire country and gave police extraordinary powers of arrest and detention. Within days, police had arrested approximately 497 people without charges and without access to lawyers. The vast majority of those arrested had no connection to the FLQ. They were Quebec. Intellectuals, artists, union organizers, and separatist politicians, people swept up in a dragnet that used the emergency powers to detain people the government considered politically inconvenient rather than criminally dangerous. Only 62 of the 497 people arrested were ever charged with anything. Of those charged, most were eventually acquitted or had charges dropped. The operation was not, in any meaningful legal sense, a targeted response to a specific terrorist threat. It was a broad suppression of political dissent carried out under cover of emergency powers. Number 17. In November of 1885, a man named Louis Riel was hanged in a prison yard in Regina, in what was then the Northwest Territories of Canada, and with his death, the Canadian government executed not just a man, but a symbol, and created a martyr whose memory has never stopped generating controversy in the more than 130 years since that morning. Riel was the leader of the Métis people, a distinct indigenous nation that had emerged from the intermarriage of French fur traders and indigenous women, primarily Cree and Ojibwe, in the country around the Red River. Riel had led two uprisings against the Canadian government, the first in 1869 and 1870, known as the Red River Resistance, and the second in 1885, known as the Northwest Resistance. Both arose from the same fundamental cause, which was the federal government's failure to recognize the land rights and the distinct cultural and political status of the Métis people as Canada expanded westward and began distributing Métis lands to incoming settlers. Riel's first uprising had resulted in the negotiated creation of the province of Manitoba, which included protections for French and Métis rights. Those protections were eroded almost immediately as English-speaking Protestant settlers arrived in large numbers, and the Métis were displaced from the land they had been promised. By 1885, Riel had spent years in exile in the United States, had experienced periods of profound psychological crisis during which he believed himself to be a prophet, sent by God to lead his people, and had been persuaded by the Métis community in the South Saskatchewan Valley to return to Canada and lead their resistance to yet another wave of dispossession. The rebellion that followed was brief. The government's forces, using the newly completed Canadian Pacific Railway to transport troops rapidly westward, defeated the Métis and their indigenous allies within weeks. Number 18. When the federal government of Canada acquired the vast territory known as Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1870, it inherited a legal and political obligation to the Métis people who had lived there for generations, an obligation it satisfied with a system of land certificates called scrip that was so riddled with loopholes and so susceptible to fraud that it functioned, in practice, as an efficient mechanism for stripping the Métis of the land they were supposedly being given. The scrip system was designed to provide each Métis individual with either a certificate redeemable for a quarter section of Crown land or a cash payment in lieu of land. On paper, it was a recognition of Métis rights. In practice, it was administered by commissioners who traveled into remote communities with land speculators close behind, and the process was corrupted at virtually every stage. Speculators paid Métis individuals small sums of cash to sign over their scrip before the recipients fully understood what they were signing. Some scrip was fraudulently obtained in the names of individuals who did not exist, or who had already died, or who were children too young to have participated in any transaction. Some government officials responsible for distributing scrip were themselves involved in the fraud. The result was that the land intended for the Métis ended up in the hands of land companies, speculators, and railway interests within months or years of being distributed. Studies of the scrip records conducted by historians in the late 20th and early 21st centuries found evidence of systematic and large-scale fraud that was known to government officials at the time and was never seriously investigated or prosecuted. Number 19. In the early 1950s, the federal government of Canada relocated Inuit families from northern Quebec to two locations in the high Arctic, Resolute Bay and Grise de Fjord, which are among the most remote and inhospitable places that human beings have ever been asked to call home. The government told the families that they would find abundant wildlife and good hunting, that conditions would be similar to what they knew, and that they could return south if they wished. None of these statements were true. The families were stranded in a place where the sun did not rise for months at a time, where the wildlife was largely unfamiliar, and where the government did not provide the promised support, and they were not allowed to go home. The relocation affected approximately 87 people in total, taken from the Inukjuak community in northern Quebec and from Pond Inlet in Nunavut. They were told the move was voluntary, but the degree to which genuine, informed consent was possible, given the authority differential between the government and isolated Inuit communities, is deeply questionable. Several families later said they had not fully understood where they were being taken or what conditions would be like, and that they had been given to understand that going was strongly preferred by the government. For decades, the government's official position was that the relocations were a welfare measure, an attempt to help Inuit families who were struggling economically by moving them to areas with better hunting. A Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples investigation in the 1990s found evidence suggesting that the relocations were at least partly motivated by Canada's desire to maintain sovereignty over the high Arctic by having Inuit settled there, essentially using families as human flagpoles in a remote corner of the Canadian North during the early Cold War period. Number 20. On the 2nd of April, 1885, on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River at a trading post called Frog Lake, a group of Cree warriors led by a man named Wandering Spirit killed 9 people, including a government official named Thomas Quinn and 2 Catholic priests. The event became known as the Frog Lake Massacre and was presented in the Canadian press of the time as an act of senseless savage violence, a framing that deeply shaped public opinion about the Northwest resistance of 1885, and that contributed to the government's decision to execute Wandering Spirit and 7 other Cree men in the largest mass hanging in Canadian history. What the framing as massacre left out, and what was rarely included in accounts of the event in the following decades, was the context from which it emerged. The Cree people of the North Saskatchewan River Valley had been reduced, in the span of just a few years, from a people with a functioning economy based on the bison hunt to a community facing starvation. The bison that had sustained the Plains indigenous peoples for thousands of years had been driven nearly to extinction by commercial hunting in the 1870s and early 1880s, a process in which Canadian and American hunters participated with no meaningful restriction from the government. The government's own Indian agents controlled access to food rations, and some of those agents used that control to coerce and abuse the communities under their authority. Thomas Quinn, one of those killed, was the Indian agent at Frog Lake and was widely despised by the community. He administered for his contemptuous and oppressive behavior. The killings took place in the context of a community facing starvation and watching their last possibility of resistance against an encroaching government collapse. None of this justifies the deaths of those who were killed, but it places those deaths in a context that is essential to understanding what happened, and that context was deliberately stripped from the accounts told to Canadians for decades afterward. Number 21. On the 8th of November, 1946, in the town of New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, a black woman named Viola Desmond sat down in the downstairs section of the Roseland Theatre and refused to move to the section designated for black patrons, which was upstairs in the balcony. She was removed from the theater by force, arrested, held in a cell overnight, tried the following morning, without access to a lawyer, convicted, and fined for the technical offense of evading a provincial amusement tax of 1 cent, because the tax on balcony tickets was fractionally less than the tax on main floor seats. Viola Desmond was not a poor woman. She was a successful businesswoman and a self-taught beautician who had built a thriving beauty salon in Halifax and who had established a school to train black beauty professionals, a school she created because black women were barred from attending the mainstream cosmetology schools of the day. She had stopped in New Glasgow on the way back from a business trip because her car had broken down. She had purchased what she believed was a floor ticket. When she was told to move upstairs, she refused. The trial lasted less than 30 minutes. Desmond had no lawyer. The magistrate who presided did not inform her that she had the right to challenge the charge, or that there were grounds to argue that what had been done to her was illegal under Nova Scotia law. She paid the fine and left. Number 22. In the summer of 1990, a land dispute near the town of Oka, Quebec, between the Mohawk community of Kanesatake and the town of Oka, which wished to expand a golf course onto land that the Mohawks claimed as sacred ancestral territory, including a burial ground, escalated into a 78-day armed standoff that shook the Canadian public and forced a confrontation with questions about Indigenous land rights, sovereignty, and the use of military force against Indigenous communities that the country had been avoiding for a very long time. The dispute over the land at Oka was not new. The Mohawks of Kanesatake had been pressing their land claims for over 2 centuries, since the colonial period, when the land was granted to a religious order and the Mohawks who had lived there were displaced. Through the 20th century, various Mohawk petitions to the government were ignored or dismissed. When the town of Oka announced plans to expand the golf course in 1989, Mohawk community members set up a blockade on a dirt road leading to the disputed area, a road known as the Pines, to prevent the expansion. In July 1990, the Quebec Provincial Police launched an assault on the blockade, during which an officer named Marcel Lemay was killed in circumstances that remain disputed, with both sides of the confrontation claiming that the other had fired first. The assault failed. Mohawk warriors held the blockade. Warriors at the Kahnawake Reserve near Montreal responded by blockading the Mercier Bridge, one of the main traffic arteries connecting Montreal's south shore to the city, causing massive daily traffic disruptions that inflamed public opinion in ways that the land dispute itself had not. Number 23. The story of the Underground Railroad, the network of people and safe houses that helped freedom-seeking enslaved people travel from the United States to Canada in the decades before the American Civil War, is one of the warmer chapters of Canadian history, a story that presents Canada as a place of refuge and freedom. It is a story worth telling. It is also an incomplete story. The full story includes the fate of those who arrived in Canada, the discrimination they faced, the racism embedded in Canadian society, and the experiences of the black loyalists who came before them and found that Canada's promises to them were worth considerably less than advertised. The black loyalists were enslaved and free black people who had been promised freedom and land by the British in exchange for supporting the Crown during the American Revolutionary War. Approximately 3,500 black loyalists arrived in Nova Scotia in 1783 as part of the larger loyalist migration from the newly independent United States. They were given land grants that were, in almost every case, smaller, less fertile, and located on worse terrain than the grants given to white loyalists. Many of the promised grants were never delivered at all. Black loyalist communities were placed in locations without adequate resources, and the settlers faced discrimination in employment and social participation throughout Nova Scotia. By 1792, approximately 1,200 of the Black Loyalists, despairing of ever finding justice in Canada, accepted an offer to sail to the new settlement of Freetown in Sierra Leone. Their departure represented a profound indictment of how Canada had treated them. Number 24. On the 1st of June, 1935, a group of approximately 1,000 unemployed men boarded freight trains in Vancouver and began traveling eastward toward Ottawa, where they intended to present their grievances directly to Prime Minister Richard Bennett and demand an end to the relief camp system, a network of government-run work camps where unemployed single men were paid 20 cents a day for hard labor in remote locations. Isolated from their communities and from any hope of finding regular employment. The journey became known as the On to Ottawa Trek, and it ended violently in Regina because the government decided to stop the men there rather than allow them to reach the capital. The relief camps had been established in 1932 under Bennett's government as a response to the mass unemployment of the Great Depression. They housed approximately 170,000 men over their years of operation. The conditions in the camps were harsh, the pay was minimal, and the men were effectively removed from the labor market and from civic life. Critics, including the political left, called the camps a form of disguised military discipline designed to control potentially radical, unemployed workers. The men in the camps largely agreed. The On to Ottawa Trek gathered additional men at every stop as the trains moved east. By the time the Trek reached Regina, the numbers had grown considerably. At that point, Prime Minister Bennett ordered the RCMP to stop the Trek from proceeding further, and he agreed to meet with a small delegation of Trek leaders in Ottawa, while the bulk of the Trekkers remained in Regina. The meeting in Ottawa was unproductive. Bennett denounced the Trek's organizers as radical agitators and refused any meaningful concessions. The Trekkers in Regina were informed that the government intended to disperse them. On July 1st, 1935, a public gathering in Regina's Market Square was raided by the RCMP and city police. A riot ensued in which one city detective was killed, hundreds of people were injured, and over 100 Trekkers were arrested. The On to Ottawa Trek was over. Number 25. The story that is rarely told alongside the heroic narrative of Canada as the terminus of the Underground Railroad is the story of slavery within Canada itself, a history that predates the American narrative and that is more intertwined with the founding of Canada than most Canadians are comfortable acknowledging. Slavery existed in Canada under both French and British colonial rule, and Indigenous people were enslaved in significant numbers alongside African enslaved people, a fact that complicates the simple story of Canada as the land of freedom. Under French colonial rule, both enslaved African people, who were referred to in colonial documents as Noirs, and enslaved Indigenous people, who were referred to as Panis, a French corruption of Pawnee that was applied to enslaved Indigenous people, regardless of their actual nation, were present in New France from at least the early 18th century. When the British took control of New France in 1763, they permitted the continuation of the existing slave system. Slavery under British colonial rule continued in what is now Canada until the gradual abolition movement took hold in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. A significant legal moment came in 1793 when Upper Canada, under Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, passed legislation that made it illegal to bring new enslaved people into the colony and provided that the children of enslaved women would be freed at age 25. This law is often celebrated as the first anti-slavery legislation in the British Empire, and it was indeed significant, but it did not immediately free any enslaved people already in the colony. Slavery continued in Upper Canada until 1834, when the British Parliament's Slavery Abolition Act came into effect across the empire. Number 26. When European settlers began arriving on the eastern coast of North America in substantial numbers in the 16th and 17th centuries, the indigenous peoples of what would become Canada were devastated by diseases to which they had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses spread through indigenous communities with catastrophic speed, killing people in numbers that are difficult to comprehend. The demographic collapse that resulted from this disease exposure fundamentally transformed the social, political, and military landscape of the continent and made the European settlement of Canada possible in ways that go far beyond what most historical accounts acknowledge. Estimates of the indigenous population of the Americas before European contact vary widely, but the scholarly consensus has shifted substantially in recent decades toward much higher numbers than were traditionally assumed, with some historians estimating that the pre-contact population of North America alone may have been as high as 12 to 18 million people. By 1900, the indigenous population of Canada had been reduced to approximately 100,000. That reduction was the product of disease, violence, forced displacement, starvation caused by the destruction of traditional food systems, and the deliberate policies of the state. The role of disease in this catastrophic decline was not always accidental. There are documented cases of European colonizers providing indigenous people with blankets and goods known to be contaminated with smallpox, most famously during the siege of Fort Pitt in 1763, an American colonial event rather than a Canadian one, but one that illustrates attitudes that were not unique to one place. Within what would become Canada, there are accounts of trading practices and deliberate policies that suggest an awareness among some colonizers that disease exposure was serving their purposes. Number 27. On the 24th of February, 1976, on a remote road on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the body of a young Mi'kmaq woman named Anna Mai Pictou, Aquash, was found in a ditch. She had been shot execution style in the back of the head at close range. She was 30 years old. Anna Mai Pictou, Aquash, had been a prominent activist with the American Indian movement, a key organizer who had participated in the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, and who had become known, feared, and respected within the indigenous rights movement on both sides of the Canadian-American border. Her death became one of the most contested and disturbing cases in the history of indigenous activism in North America. Aquash was born in Nova Scotia and grew up in poverty on a reserve before moving to the United States as a young woman, where she became deeply involved in the American Indian movement's organizing. She was known for her courage, her commitment, and her effectiveness as an organizer. She had been arrested by the FBI, and she had been repeatedly harassed by federal law enforcement in the years before her death. At the time her body was found, it was misidentified by FBI agents. Her hands were cut off and sent to Washington for fingerprinting, and she was initially buried as a Jane Doe before her family identified her. For decades, the question of who killed Anna Mai Pictou, Aquash, was shrouded in competing accounts, informants, and the devastating political tensions within AIM that had produced a culture of paranoia and accusation. The FBI was accused by many in the indigenous community of having directly or indirectly facilitated her murder. Internal AIM tensions, fueled by informants, led to some within the movement falsely identifying her as an FBI informant, a designation that in the violent atmosphere of that period was tantamount to a death sentence. Number 28. The Indian Act, first passed in 1876 and amended many times since but never repealed, is perhaps the single most consequential piece of legislation in the history of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations in Canada. a law that gave the federal government sweeping authority over almost every aspect of Indigenous life, and that contained within it provisions of such extraordinary intrusiveness that if applied to any other population in Canada, they would have been recognized immediately as the apparatus of a police state. The Act defined who was and was not legally recognized as an Indian, a definition that the government controlled entirely and that was used as a tool of control and exclusion. It governed where Indigenous people could live, how they could use their lands, how their children were educated, who could enter their reserves, whether they could hire a lawyer to pursue land claims, whether they could gather for ceremonies, and whether they could purchase and consume alcohol. Each of these provisions was a point of control, and each was applied in ways that served the interest of the government and the settler population, rather than the well-being of Indigenous communities. Among the most destructive provisions was one that stripped Indian status from any Indigenous woman who married a non-Indigenous man, while granting Indian status to any non-Indigenous woman who married a status Indian man. This provision separated women from their communities and families, denied their children status and band membership, and was only partially addressed through amendments in 1985, with the full correction of its effects taking decades of additional litigation and legislation. The Act also prohibited, between 1884 and 1951, the practice of the potlatch and other ceremonial gatherings that were central to the cultures of many Indigenous nations on the West Coast and Plains. Police were authorized to arrest anyone participating in these ceremonies. Objects used in potlatches were confiscated and ended up in museums across Canada and around the world. Communities were expected to hold their cultures in suspension until the government decided they might be allowed to resume them. The Indian Act remains in effect today. Reforms have softened some of its most overtly colonial provisions, but its fundamental structure, a federal law governing the lives of Indigenous people in ways that no equivalent law governs any other group of Canadians, remains intact. Number 29. In the spring of 1997, a young Stoney Nakoda man named Dudley George had been dead for nearly 2 years, shot by an Ontario provincial police officer during a protest at Ipperwash Provincial Park, a park that had been built on land the federal government had expropriated from the Stony Point Ojibwe community during the Second World War over the community's strong objection, promising that the land would be returned when the war was over, and then failing to return it for over 50 years. The Stony Point community had been pressing for the return of the expropriated land since 1945. By 1995, frustrated decades of bureaucratic delay, members of the community began occupying the land itself, which was still under Canadian Armed Forces control. In September of that year, following a burial ground being uncovered within the park, some members of the community moved their occupation into the adjacent provincial park. The Ontario Provincial Police was ordered to remove them. On the night of September 6, 1995, OPP officers in full riot gear confronted the protesters. In circumstances that remain disputed in their details, officers opened fire with pepper spray, stun grenades, and a rapid-fire gun loaded with wooden dowels. Dudley George was struck in the chest. He died early the following morning. He was the only person shot. He was unarmed. For years afterward, evidence emerged suggesting that the decision to move aggressively against the Ipperwash protesters had been made at the highest levels of the Ontario provincial government under Premier Mike Harris. In 1997, an OPP officer named Ken Dean was convicted of criminal negligence causing death for shooting Dudley George, though he was never imprisoned and was later reinstated to the police force. A public inquiry conducted by Justice Sidney Linden from 2004 to 2007 concluded that the Ontario government including Premier Harris, had played a direct role in the events leading to Dudley George's death. The inquiry's report recommended sweeping changes to how the government dealt with indigenous land disputes. The land at Ipperwash was officially returned to the Stony Point community in 2009. Number 30. The Métis. Script fraud described earlier was not the only fraudulent land transaction in Canadian history involving Indigenous peoples, but the story of how the Hudson's Bay Company's deed of surrender of 1870 transferred control of Rupert's Land, an area of approximately 7.7 million square kilometers covering most of what is now central and western Canada, represents an extraordinary transfer of territory that the Indigenous peoples living within that territory were given no voice in negotiating and no formal role in consenting to, despite the fact that the legal basis for the Hudson's Bay Company's claim to the land was itself deeply questionable. The Hudson's Bay Company had been granted its charter by the British Crown in 1670, giving it exclusive trading rights and nominal sovereignty over the vast watershed draining into Hudson Bay. The company called this territory Rupert's Land, after Prince Rupert, the first governor of the company. The charter did not consult, involve, or acknowledge the indigenous nations who had lived in this territory for thousands of years. It simply assumed the right of the British Crown to grant to a private company authority over lands already inhabited by others. For 200 years, the Hudson's Bay Company operated its fur trade within Rupert's Land, maintaining a complex and often mutually dependent relationship with indigenous communities whose knowledge, labor, and participation made the fur trade possible. When the company decided in the 1860s that it wished to sell its territorial rights to the newly confederating Canadian government, negotiations were conducted between the company, the British government, and the Canadian government. The Indigenous peoples of the territory were not part of those negotiations at any stage. The Canadian government paid the Hudson's Bay Company £300,000 and allowed it to retain significant land rights around its trading posts. In exchange, Canada received control over 7.7 million square kilometers of territory. The Métis and Indigenous peoples of Rupert's Land woke up one day to find that they had been transferred from one government to another with no consultation and no recognition of their own rights to the land on which they lived. Number 31. In the decades following Confederation in 1867, the federal government of Canada pursued a policy toward the Plains Indigenous peoples that involved the negotiation of a series of numbered treaties through which Indigenous nations ceded enormous areas of land in exchange for reserves, annual payments, and various promises of support and services. These treaties are presented in Canadian history as evidence of a relatively peaceful and lawful process of land transfer, distinct from the more violent dispossession that characterized American history. The full story of how those treaties were negotiated and what happened to the promises they contained tells a somewhat different story. The treaties were negotiated between the 1870s and the early 1900s in the immediate aftermath of the near extinction of the bison. Indigenous communities negotiating with government commissioners were communities that were already in crisis, already watching their traditional economy collapse around them, already dependent on government food rations in many cases, already aware that the alternative to signing was even more precarious than the uncertain promises on the table. The negotiating context was not one of equals. Many oral accounts from the descendants of treaty signatories describe promises made by government commissioners during negotiations that are not reflected in the written text of the treaties, including promises about the right to continue traditional practices, about the right to hunt and fish throughout the ceded territories, about the level of ongoing government support, and about the nature of the relationship between the Crown and the treaty nations. Indigenous oral traditions maintain these promised terms carefully. When those promises were not honored in the written implementation of the treaties, Indigenous peoples pursued their claims through every available channel. The question of what was actually promised in those negotiations and what obligations the treaties created for the Canadian government is still being actively litigated in Canadian courts. Treaty rights recognized in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 gave Indigenous treaty rights constitutional protection, but the interpretation of what those rights encompass remains contested and continues to be the subject of litigation over 150 years after the first numbered treaties were signed. Number 32. In the early years of the Cold War, the Canadian government established a facility near the small community of Port Radium in what is now the Northwest Territories, where uranium ore had been discovered in the 1930s and where operations had been conducted to extract uranium that eventually contributed to the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The people who worked at that facility were Dean men from the community of Deline, who carried bags of uranium ore from the mine to the barges that would transport it south, and who did so without any protective equipment and without being informed of the health risks associated with what they were handling. The Dene men who worked as ore carriers at Port Radium came to call themselves the coolies of the mine, a term that reflected their understanding of the exploitative nature of the relationship. They worked without gloves or masks. They slept near the ore sacks on the barges. They washed their families' clothes with the water from the contaminated lake. When the men began to develop cancers and other serious health conditions at rates significantly above what would be expected in a comparable population, the community began to wonder whether there was a connection to the work they and their fathers and grandfathers had done at Port Radium. The community of Deline pursued answers from the federal government for decades. A government-commissioned health study in the 1990s concluded that there was no definitive evidence of elevated cancer rates in the community, a conclusion that the community rejected as inadequate given the recognized carcinogenic properties of uranium ore and the conditions under which the ore had been handled. Community members noted that the American and Canadian workers at the mine itself wore protective equipment and were subject to radiation monitoring, while the DNA carriers were provided with nothing. In 2005, the federal government acknowledged what had happened at Port Radium and committed to cleaning up the contaminated site and to a process of healing with the community of Deline. The cleanup of the mine site was a complex and expensive undertaking that took many years. The broader question of accountability for what was done to the DNA workers who helped build the atomic age without ever being told what they were touching remained incompletely resolved. Number 33. On the morning of December 6, 1917, two ships collided in the narrows of Halifax Harbor, the most catastrophic maritime accident in Canadian history, and at the time, the largest human-made explosion in history, an event so powerful that it was felt hundreds of kilometers away and that killed approximately 2,000 people instantly, injured an estimated 9,000 more, and left roughly 25,000 people without adequate shelter in a Nova Scotia December. The Halifax explosion is remembered in the city with solemn annual observances, and it deserves to be. What is less remembered is the role of negligence, poor communication, and a series of administrative failures at multiple levels that allowed the catastrophe to occur. The Mont Blanc was a French munitions ship loaded with an extraordinarily dangerous cargo, approximately 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and 35 tons of benzol. The ship was entering Halifax Harbor to resupply for the transatlantic crossing when it collided with a Norwegian ship called the Imo in the narrows known as the Narrows. The collision was the result of confused signals and miscommunication about which vessel had the right of way in the channel. The crew of the Mont Blanc knew exactly what their ship was carrying. After the collision, they abandoned ship and rowed for shore, attempting to warn people away, but communicating in French in an English-speaking city under conditions of enormous confusion. A crowd of people gathered on the Richmond shore to watch the burning ship. When the ship exploded approximately 20 minutes after the collision, those people were killed by the blast wave, by flying debris, and by the collapse of the buildings they stood beside. The winter that followed the explosion was brutal. Aid poured in from across Canada and from Boston, Massachusetts, beginning a tradition of mutual support between Halifax and Boston that continues to the present day. A commission of inquiry was convened, and it assigned blame primarily to the pilot of the Mont Blanc and to the captain of the Emo, a conclusion that was later overturned on appeal in the captain of the Emo's case. The question of whether the presence of a fully loaded munition ship in a busy civilian harbor without adequate safety protocols in place represented a systemic failure received less sustained attention. Number 34. In the summer of 1970, a royal commission studying the status of women in Canada released a report that revealed, among many other findings, that the Canadian federal government had been quietly and systematically purging gay and lesbian employees from the civil service, the military, and the RCMP for over a decade, and that this purge was not the result of rogue action by individual officials, but was a deliberate policy supported at the highest levels of the security establishment. This revelation became the foundation for what would eventually be recognized as one of the largest systematic violations of workplace rights in Canadian history. The security establishment's justification for the purge was the theory that homosexual employees were vulnerable to blackmail by Soviet intelligence agents who could threaten to expose their sexuality unless they cooperated as spies. This theory, which was adopted from similar policies in the United States and Britain, assumed that the primary vulnerability came from the illegality and social stigma of homosexuality rather than from the orientation itself, an assumption that pointed clearly toward what the actual solution should have been: decriminalization and destigmatization. Instead, the government's chosen response was to eliminate the employees it had put in a vulnerable position through its own laws and social norms. The RCMP spent years developing increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying gay and lesbian employees, including the fruit machine mentioned earlier, surveillance of known gathering places for gay men, interrogation tactics designed to extract admissions, and informant networks within government departments. People identified as homosexual were not simply fired. They were often pressured to name others, their cooperation in identifying colleagues being made a condition of any lenient treatment. The program thus replicated itself through the networks of people each identified person was pressured to betray. The scale of the purge, affecting an estimated 9,000 people over several decades, was not fully documented until historians and journalists began investigating it seriously in the 21st century. The formal government apology delivered by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2017 was welcomed by survivors and advocates, though many noted with some bitterness that the men and women most harmed by the policy had spent their careers, and in many cases their entire lives, under a cloud that had been entirely the government's creation. Number 35. The Doukhobors were a pacifist Christian sect that originated in Russia, whose members rejected the authority of both the state and the institutional church, refused military service, held property communally, and practiced a radical spiritual egalitarianism that brought them into sustained conflict with the Russian imperial government. Approximately 7,500 Doukhobors arrived in Canada between 1898 and 1899, settling primarily on the prairies of what are now Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where the Canadian government had offered them large tracts of land in recognition of their industry and willingness to homestead in challenging conditions. The story of what happened to them afterward is one of persistent religious and cultural persecution by a Canadian government that proved unable to honor the terms on which they had been invited to come. The central conflict between the Doukhobors and the Canadian government arose over the requirement that settlers in the West take an oath of allegiance and register their homesteads as individual rather than communal properties. The Doukhobors, as a matter of deep religious conviction, refused to take oaths and objected to private property as a principle. The government, which needed settlers and had made promises to attract them, was initially flexible. That flexibility eroded over time, and eventually the government canceled the land grants of thousands of Doukhobors who had not met the individual registration requirements. In British Columbia, a radical faction of Doukhobors, called the Sons of Freedom, came into ongoing conflict with provincial authorities over the compulsory education of their children, which they believed would corrupt their children with worldly values. In the 1950s, the British Columbia government forcibly removed approximately 170 Doukhobor children from their families and placed them in a residential school at New Denver, where they were held for years in conditions that bore a disturbing resemblance to the indigenous residential school system operating simultaneously across the country. The children were held away from their parents, required to attend school, and not returned home for years. The New Denver facility and the forced removal of Doukhobor children remained a source of deep community trauma for decades. In 2004, the British Columbia government issued an expression of regret to the Doukhobor community for the removal of children, stopping short of a formal apology, but acknowledging that harm had been done. Number 36. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885, is celebrated as one of the foundational achievements of Canadian nation-building. The steel spine that connected the country from sea to sea and made Confederation a practical reality rather than a political aspiration. What is less prominently featured in this national story is the role of approximately 15,000 to 17,000 Chinese workers who performed the most dangerous portions of the railway's construction through the mountains of British Columbia, who died in numbers that have never been precisely counted, and who were paid substantially less than their white counterparts for the same work, under the same deadly conditions. The Chinese workers were recruited primarily from Guangdong province in southern China by labor contractors who brought them to British Columbia, where the railway's most challenging terrain awaited. The sections through the Fraser Canyon and the Rocky Mountains required the construction of tunnels blasted through solid rock, the laying of track on near vertical slopes, the construction of bridges over deep gorges, and constant exposure to avalanches, rockfalls, and the unpredictable consequences of the nitroglycerin and black powder used for blasting. White workers received between $1 and $2.50 per day. Chinese workers received $1 per day and were required to pay for their own food and housing out of that amount. The death toll among Chinese workers during the construction of the CPR is not precisely known because comprehensive records were never kept. Estimates range from several hundred to well over 1,000 workers killed. They died in blasting accidents, avalanches, falls, and from diseases including scurvy and smallpox that disproportionately affected them due to inadequate nutrition and medical care. Their bodies were often buried where they fell. A small number of remains were eventually recovered and repatriated to China in the 1880s. When the railway was completed, Prime Minister MacDonald's government responded to the Chinese workers' contribution by implementing the Chinese head tax and debating in Parliament whether Chinese people were suitable for Canadian society at all. The The contributions of the Chinese railway workers were not officially acknowledged by the Canadian government until Prime Minister Harper's apology in 2006. Number 37. At 23 minutes past 4 in the morning on the 29th of April, 1903, the north face of Turtle Mountain in what is now southwestern Alberta collapsed without warning, sending an estimated 90 million tons of limestone crashing down onto the sleeping town of Frank and the coal mine that sat at the mountain's base. In approximately 90 seconds, a section of the mountain, roughly 1 kilometer wide, 1 kilometer high, and roughly 150 meters thick, slid down the slope and buried an eastern portion of Frank under 30 meters of rock. Approximately 90 people were killed, though precise records of who was in the affected area made an exact death toll difficult to establish. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in Canadian history. What is less well remembered about the Frank slide is that the instability of Turtle Mountain had been noted and documented before the collapse, that the coal company operating the mine at the mountain's base had been warned about the structural risks, and that the decision to continue mining operations in the face of those warnings, combined with the decision to allow people to continue living in the affected portion of the town, created a situation in which a foreseeable disaster was allowed to become an actual one. Indigenous people in the region, specifically the Blackfoot, had a name for Turtle Mountain that translated roughly as the mountain that moves, a name that encoded centuries of observation of the mountain's behavior and its unusual geology. European settlers did not seek or integrate this knowledge when establishing the town of Frank. Geological surveyors who examined the mountain in the years before the collapse had noted that it was heavily fractured and had expressed concern about its stability. The Dominion Coal Company, which operated the mine, was aware of cracks developing in the mountain face above the mine. Operations continued. After the collapse, the surviving portion of Frank was rebuilt at a safer distance from the mountain. Investigations were conducted, but no meaningful accountability was assigned for the decision to continue mining and habitation in a location that the geological record and indigenous knowledge both suggested was unsafe. The Frank Slide remains a landmark and a memorial, visited each year by people who learn about the disaster, but rarely about the warnings that preceded it. Number 38. The story of black settlement on the Canadian prairies in the early 20th century is almost entirely absent from the standard accounts of Western Canadian history, which tend to center the stories of European immigrants, the major waves of Ukrainian, German, Scandinavian, and British settlers who came to farm the prairies in the first decades after Confederation. But in the years between 1905 and 1912, several thousand black Americans, primarily from Oklahoma and other southern states, traveled north to the newly created provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta, seeking land and freedom from the racial violence and legal discrimination of the Jim Crow South. They came because the Canadian government had been advertising free land in the United States, and because Canada's reputation as a place of freedom, bolstered by the legacy of the Underground Railroad, gave them reason to hope that they would be treated as equal citizens if they could establish themselves as successful farmers. Several hundred black homesteaders did establish farms in central Alberta, in communities near Amber Valley, Maidstone, and Eldon, and they built schools and churches and social institutions and contributed to the agricultural development of the region. What the Canadian government did in response to this migration was a remarkable illustration of how official Canadian policy could simultaneously be officially non-discriminatory and systematically exclusionary in practice. Interior Minister Frank Oliver, who was a founding editor of the Edmonton Bulletin and a man whose racial views were not ambiguous, instructed immigration officials to refuse entry to black settlers by any pretext available, including fabricated medical grounds. He dispatched agents to Oklahoma and Texas to spread discouraging rumors about the Canadian climate. He considered and briefly pursued legislation to explicitly ban black immigration, retreating only when it was pointed out that such a law would create diplomatic complications with the United States. The black settlers who did arrive found a mixed welcome. Some of their white neighbors were friendly and cooperative. Others were hostile and organized petitions calling for the exclusion of black settlers from the prairies, petitions that attracted many signatures. The black prairie farming communities survived for decades, in some cases into the second half of the 20th century, before the combined pressures of economic hardship, drought, and the migration of young people towards cities reduced them to memories and historical markers. Number 39. In 1988, the Supreme Court of Canada issued a ruling in a case involving a Métis man from Northern Ontario named Steve Powley that would eventually help establish the legal foundation for Métis rights in Canada. But the full story of how Métis people arrived at that moment of legal recognition is a story of more than a century of being officially invisible. A people defined out of existence by the federal government's determination to avoid the legal and financial responsibilities that would have flowed from recognizing their distinct status. The Canadian government's position through most of the 20th century was essentially that the Métis were not a distinct people with distinct rights, but were a mixed population whose indigenous heritage had been extinguished through the scrip process. This position conveniently ignored the fact that the scrip process had been fraudulent, that Métis communities had maintained their distinct language, culture, and identity through generations, and that the Constitution Act of 1982, which recognized the rights of Canada's Aboriginal peoples, explicitly listed the Métis as one of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. Recognition without resources was the condition under which Métis people lived for most of the late 20th century. Provinces argued that Métis rights were a federal responsibility. The federal government argued that Métis people fell outside its jurisdiction because they did not live on reserves and were not covered by the Indian Act. The Métis Nation organizations representing Métis communities across the prairies and in Ontario pursued their rights through political organizing, constitutional negotiations, and ultimately through the courts. The Powley decision in 2003 confirmed that Métis people hold constitutional rights, including the right to harvest, and subsequent court cases have continued to define the boundaries of those rights. The question of federal jurisdiction and responsibility for the Métis and the question of land rights arising from the fraudulent scrip process remain areas of active legal and political negotiation. The people whose ancestors built Red River carts and made pemmican and developed a distinctive fiddle music that still plays at Métis. Celebrations are still waiting for many of the promises that were made to them in 1870. Number 40. The story of what happened to the children in Canada's residential school system contains within it a specifically disturbing subset that was not widely known until relatively recently, involving the use of children in medical and nutritional experiments conducted by government scientists and researchers from universities, experiments that were carried out between the 1940s and the 1950s, and that were documented in scientific literature of the period, but that were not widely discussed in the context of the residential school system's legacy until a historian named Ian Mosby published his research in 2013. The experiments Mosby documented involved nutritional science. In the 1940s and early 1950s, Canadian government researchers studying nutrition and the effects of various dietary deficiencies conducted controlled studies using residential school children as their subjects. Schools where the children were already malnourished were used as experimental populations. In some cases, Children who were experiencing the effects of dietary deficiency were denied treatment specifically so that their untreated deterioration could be documented and compared against the improvement in a control group that did receive treatment. Dental services were withheld from some children as part of the experimental protocols. The researchers involved were not secret conspirators. They published their findings in academic journals. They presented their work at conferences. The studies were conducted with the knowledge and cooperation of the Indian Affairs branch of the federal government, which saw the undernourished children in residential schools as a convenient research population that was already under government supervision and could be studied without the complications that would arise from using children in the general population. When Mosby's research became public, the response of the Canadian government was initially to question the interpretation of the documents before the weight of the archival evidence made any sustained denial impossible. The revelation added another dimension to the already devastating picture of the residential school system and of what the government's relationship to the children in its care had actually been. Number 41. In the summer of 1942, the United States military, which had assumed operational control of many construction projects in northwestern Canada and Alaska as part of the war effort, began building the Alaska Highway, one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects ever undertaken in North American history, a road that stretched through approximately 2,700 kilometers of largely unmapped wilderness. The project was completed in extraordinary time, just over 8 months, largely through the labor of approximately 11,000 American soldiers, a significant proportion of whom were black soldiers segregated into separate units under the still segregated structure of the American military. The black soldiers of the segregated units were assigned disproportionately to the most difficult sections of the highway, through the most challenging terrain, and were subjected to the discriminatory treatment standard in the Jim Crow military of the period. They performed extraordinary work under brutal conditions, enduring temperatures of minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, equipment breakdowns, and terrain that had defeated earlier surveyors. The performance of these segregated units challenged the racial hierarchies that had assigned them to the hardest jobs, and their achievement was documented at the time by journalists, including a young photographer named Tony Frissell. What Canada's specific role in this history involves is the question of how Canadian officials and the Canadian public responded to the presence of black American soldiers in the Canadian Northwest, and the documented evidence that some Canadian officials raised concerns about black soldiers being stationed in or near Canadian communities, reflecting racial attitudes on the Canadian side of the border that mirrored those across it. The Alaska Highway's completion is celebrated. The story of the segregated black soldiers who built significant portions of it is less consistently told, and the encounter between their presence and the racial attitudes of the Canadian communities near which they worked has received even less sustained historical attention. Number 42. When the territory that is now the province of Prince Edward Island entered Confederation in 1873, it did so having already dispossessed the Mi'kmaq people who had inhabited the island for thousands of years, to a degree that was perhaps more complete than anywhere else in what would become Canada. The Mi'kmaq of the island, who called their home Epikwitk, meaning something like cradled on the waves, had been reduced by disease, displacement, and deliberate colonial policy to a small and marginalized population, with access to only tiny fragments of the land that had sustained their people for millennia. The Mi'kmaq of the island had signed a treaty with the British in 1752, one of the peace and friendship treaties that the Mi'kmaq nation signed with the British Crown along the eastern seaboard, treaties that promised mutual recognition and peaceful coexistence. Like most of the peace and friendship treaties, these promises were honored in the short term and abandoned as the settler population grew and the demand for land intensified. By the time Prince Edward Island became a British colony, the island's entire surface had been divided into lots and granted to absentee landlords in a lottery held in London in 1767. The Mi'kmaq were not consulted. Their occupation of the land was not considered. Over the following century, the island's settler economy developed through agriculture and fishing, and the Mi'kmaq people who remained were pushed to the margins, dependent on the charity of a colonial society that was systematically benefiting from the displacement of their ancestors. Small reserves were eventually established on portions of land that the agricultural settlers found less useful, lands that were insufficient to sustain the communities placed on them. The story of the Mi'kmaq of Prince Edward Island is a microcosm of colonialism's most complete expression. A people present for thousands of years, reduced within a few generations to marginal survival on their own territory. Their treaty, rights unacknowledged, their history largely absent from the tourist brochures and school curricula of a province that owes its existence to their displacement. Number 43. Canada's national mythology includes a strong tradition of peacekeeping, an image of the Canadian military as a neutral, benevolent presence in global conflict zones, an image whose origins are conventionally traced to the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Minister of External Affairs Lester Pearson proposed the creation of a United Nations emergency force to separate the combatants, earning him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957. The peacekeeping identity has been one of the most powerful and persistent elements of how Canadians understand their country's role in the world. What the peacekeeping mythology can obscure is both the limitations of Canada's actual peacekeeping record in the post-Cold War era and the historical reality that Canadian military history includes episodes of considerable violence that do not fit easily within the peacekeeping image. Canadian soldiers participated in the Korean War, which was a brutal and destructive conflict in which approximately 516 Canadians were killed. Canada's role in the First World War included the use of chemical weapons that had been prohibited by the Hague Convention, a fact that rarely appears in accounts of Canadian military history. Canadian forces committed what some historians have classified as atrocities in Afghanistan, and the investigation of those allegations was the subject of judicial proceedings and government controversy in the years following Canada's withdrawal. The Somalia affair of the early 1990s provided the most direct challenge to the peacekeeping image, when members of the Canadian Airborne Regiment, deployed as part of a United Nations mission in Somalia, tortured and beat to death a 16-year-old Somali boy named Shidan Aron in March 1993. The photographs of Arone's torture, which showed soldiers posing with the dying boy, became one of the most disturbing images in Canadian military history. The government's response to the scandal, including the disbanding of the Airborne Regiment and the termination of a public inquiry before it had completed its work, generated its own controversy about accountability and transparency. Number 44. The question of what the Canadian government knew about Japanese-Canadian loyalty and security risk during the Second World War, and the degree to which the decision to intern and dispossess Japanese Canadians was driven by genuine security concerns versus racial prejudice and the desire of British Columbia's economic interests to eliminate Japanese Canadian competitors, has been answered fairly clearly by the historical record. The internment was driven primarily by race hatred and economic opportunism, with security concerns providing a post hoc justification. Documents declassified in the decades after the war revealed that Canadian military and naval intelligence had assessed the Japanese Canadian population before and during the period of the internment and had concluded that they did not pose a meaningful security threat. The naval intelligence officer responsible for assessing the BC coast had reported that the Japanese-Canadian fishing fleet, which was seized early in the crisis, did not pose a sabotage threat. The RCMP, which was responsible for monitoring potentially subversive activity, had not identified significant numbers of Japanese Canadians as security risks. What was driving the internment was the sustained pressure from British Columbia's political establishment and business community, which had been expressing hostility toward the Japanese Canadian population for decades before Pearl Harbor. Japanese Canadians had established successful fishing operations, farming operations, and businesses that competed directly with white-owned enterprises. The economic resentment generated by this competition had produced demands for exclusion long before the war provided a convenient justification. The government's own documents show clearly that the decision to intern the entire Japanese Canadian population, rather than the small number of individuals who had been identified through actual security assessment as potentially problematic, was a political decision made in response to political pressure from British Columbia, not a response to a genuine security threat. The acknowledgement of this reality was part of what made the 1988 apology and compensation package significant, because it acknowledged that the government had known, or should have known, that what it was doing was unjust. Number 45. The Great Famine in Ireland, which lasted from approximately 1845 to 1852 and killed approximately 1 million people while driving another million or more to emigrate, sent waves of desperate Irish men and women to Canada, particularly to Quebec, where the port of Grosse Ile in the St. Lawrence River served as a quarantine station for incoming ships. The human tragedy that unfolded at Grosse Ile in 1847, the worst single year of the famine migration, is one of the darkest chapters in the story of immigration to Canada, and it produced a burial ground on that small island that holds the remains of approximately 6,000 people who died there, many of them children. The ships that carried Irish famine refugees to Canada in 1847 became known as coffin ships, a name that reflected the conditions on board with grim accuracy. Passengers were frequently malnourished before they boarded, and the ships were overcrowded, poorly provisioned, and ventilated inadequately for the numbers they carried. Typhus spread rapidly in these conditions. Passengers died at sea in large numbers, and ships arrived in the St. Lawrence carrying populations that were already deeply ill. Grosse Ile was overwhelmed. The quarantine station had been established decades earlier to manage the routine processing of immigrants, not to handle a humanitarian catastrophe. In 1847, as many as 40 ships sometimes waited in line in the river waiting to be processed, their sick passengers unable to disembark, dying on the ships as the wait dragged on. Those who made it ashore found that the quarantine sheds were overcrowded beyond any reasonable capacity. Healthy passengers were mixed with the sick, accelerating the spread of disease. Medical staff who worked at the island contracted typhus and died. Those who survived Grosse Ile and traveled on to Montreal, Quebec City, and Toronto frequently arrived in desperate condition in cities that were not prepared to receive them. Local governments and charitable organizations struggled to provide basic care. The response of the Canadian public was a mixture of genuine charity and considerable hostility. The Irish famine migrants were the largest single wave of immigration Canada had received, and they arrived too sick and too poor to be welcome everywhere they went. Number 46. In 1907, a physician named Peter Henderson Bryce submitted to the Canadian government a report that documented, with precision and with the authority of direct medical investigation, the catastrophic death rates of Indigenous children in the residential school system. Bryce had been commissioned to assess the health conditions in Western Canadian residential schools, and what he found horrified him. The annual death rates in the schools he examined were extraordinary, and he calculated that of the children admitted to one school in a 3-year period, nearly half had died. Bryce's report recommended immediate and substantial reform. The buildings needed to be improved. The ventilation needed to be corrected. The nutrition needed to be improved. The children who were sick needed to be separated from those who were healthy. He estimated that with proper attention, most of the deaths that were occurring were preventable. His report was submitted through proper channels to the Department of Indian Affairs. Duncan Campbell Scott, who was Bryce's superior in the bureaucratic hierarchy, received the report and did not act on it. The schools continued operating under the conditions Bryce had described. The children continued dying. Bryce continued pushing for action and was met with bureaucratic resistance at every turn. His career effectively stagnated, and his superiors made clear that his continued advocacy was not welcome. In 1922, Peter Henderson Bryce published his findings himself, at his own expense, in a pamphlet titled The Story of a National Crime, being an appeal for justice to the Indians of Canada. He was 70 years old. He had spent 15 years watching the government do nothing with the information he had provided. The pamphlet attracted some attention in the press, but did not produce the reforms he had spent his career demanding. He died in 1932. The residential school system continued operating for another 64 years. The national reckoning with what his report had described began in earnest only after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission completed its work in 2015. Number 47. The History of Relations between the French and English. Founding Peoples of Canada is the version of Canadian historical conflict most familiar to most Canadians, but the history of the founding of New France itself and of the relationships between French colonizers and the many indigenous nations they encountered was considerably more violent and complicated than the fur trade alliance story that often stands in for the fuller account. Samuel de Champlain, who is celebrated as the founder of Quebec and is often portrayed as a relatively enlightened figure in the history of early Canadian colonialism, made a military alliance with the Huron-Wendat and Algonquin peoples that he cemented in 1609 by participating directly in a battle against their Haudenosaunee enemies at what is now Lake Champlain. Champlain and 2 French companions, armed with arquebuses, joined a party of several hundred Huron-Wendat and Algonquin warriors in an engagement against a Haudenosaunee force. When the Haudenosaunee warriors advanced, Champlain fired his arquebus into their ranks, killing 2 chiefs with a single shot and wounding a third. The Haudenosaunee, who had never encountered firearms, scattered in shock and were pursued. The battle was a military success for Champlain's allies and established French credibility as allies. What it also did was embed France and the French colonial enterprise in a set of indigenous political alliances and conflicts that would shape the military and political history of North America for over a century. The enmity between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and New France that resulted from this and subsequent engagements contributed to the Beaver Wars of the 17th century, a series of conflicts in which the Haudenosaunee, armed by Dutch and later British traders, devastated several of the nations allied with the French, including the Huron-Wendat people, who were dispersed as a nation in 1649 and 1650 in a series of attacks that killed many people and sent survivors fleeing across the region. The Beaver Wars reshaped the indigenous political landscape of the Northeast in ways that affected every subsequent colonial encounter. The role of French and then British and Dutch arms traders in fueling those wars, and the role of Champlain's initial military decision in setting events in motion, is a thread of history that is rarely followed to its full conclusion in general Canadian historical education. Number 48. In 2004, a report by Justice Dennis O'Connor into the activities of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Canadian Security Intelligence Service in connection with the case of Maher Arar, documented one of the clearest cases of Canadian government complicity in the torture of a Canadian citizen that has ever been placed in the public record. Arar was a Canadian citizen of Syrian origin who was detained by American authorities at John F. Kennedy Airport in September 2002 while changing planes, and who was subsequently deported to Syria rather than to Canada, where he was held for nearly a year, tortured, and subjected to conditions that O'Connor's report described in terms that were measured but devastating. The RCMP had provided American authorities with inaccurate information that characterized Arar as a security threat and a person of interest in terrorism investigations. This information was wrong. Arar had no connection to terrorism, but the information provided by the RCMP was used by American authorities as part of the basis for their decision to deport him to Syria rather than allow him to continue to Canada. For 10 months, Arar was held in a cell in Syria that O'Connor's report described as roughly the size of a grave, where he was beaten with electrical cables, deprived of sleep, and subjected to other forms of torture. His family and his lawyers were given no meaningful access to him. The Canadian government's initial response to his detention was inadequate, and there is evidence that Canadian consular officials were aware of his situation and did not press urgently for his release. When Arar was finally returned to Canada in October 2003, the government's initial public posture was one that declined to challenge the American decision that had led to his deportation. It was only the sustained advocacy of Arar and his wife Monia Mazi, and the work of journalists who pursued the story, that eventually forced the commission of inquiry that produced O'Connor's damning findings. In 2007, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to Arar, and the government provided him with $10.5 million in compensation. The American government never acknowledged that it had made an error, and never removed Arar from its watch lists. Number 49. Among the many dark chapters of 20th century Canadian history, the sterilization of Indigenous women without their meaningful consent is one that was not widely known outside the communities most affected until relatively recently, and that began coming to public attention primarily through the testimony of survivors who spoke to journalists and to the United Nations Committee Against Torture in the 2000s and afterward. The practice of coerced or forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canadian hospitals, primarily through two-ball ligation, was documented to have continued in some cases well into the 1990s and potentially beyond. Survivors described being approached for consent to sterilization while in active labor, immediately before or after cesarean sections, and in other situations where they were in pain, under the influence of anesthesia, frightened, and in no position to make an informed, autonomous decision about permanent sterilization. Some described being told that they would not receive further care unless they signed consent forms they did not fully understand. Some described being shown forms written in English when they were more comfortable in their Indigenous languages. Some described being told that sterilization was necessary for medical reasons that were not explained or that they later understood to be false. The practice occurred in hospitals across the country, and it was rooted in attitudes that intersected the existing history of eugenic thinking, with specifically racist assumptions about Indigenous women's fitness for motherhood and about the desirability of reducing Indigenous birth rates. It was not a centrally organized program in the way that Alberta's legislated eugenics program had been, but it reflected attitudes among some medical professionals that Indigenous women's reproductive autonomy deserved less respect than that of other patients. In 2018, the Senate of Canada issued a report calling for a formal investigation into the practice and for specific measures to protect Indigenous women's reproductive rights in medical settings. The federal government committed to action. Survivors continued to come forward with testimonies that suggested the practice had been more widespread and had continued longer than was initially acknowledged. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of survivors, and legal proceedings were ongoing as of the time these events were recorded. Number 50. And finally, we come to the last of our 50 stories, a story not of a single event, but of an ongoing question that sits at the heart of what Canada is and what it might become. The question of what it means to acknowledge a history honestly, and what is required to move from acknowledgement to something more like justice. In June of 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its final report, which included 94 calls to action, directed at governments, churches, educational institutions, and the broader Canadian public. The calls to action were the Commission's practical response to the evidence it had gathered, a roadmap toward a Canada that had genuinely confronted its history and was working in a sustained and serious way to change the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The response to the calls to action in the years since the report's release has been partial at best. Some actions have been taken. Federal legislation has been changed in some areas. Funding has been committed for some purposes, but implementation has been slow, uneven, and in many cases incomplete. The children whose remains were identified near former residential school sites in 2021 were a reminder, if one was needed, that the history the Commission had documented was not a closed chapter, but a wound that was still, in many families and communities, actively open. What the 50 stories we have explored tonight share is not simply their darkness. They share a quality of having been known and deliberately unacknowledged by those with the power to act on them. The physician Peter Bryce knew what was happening to children in the residential schools in 1907. The government knew what it was doing to Japanese Canadians in 1942. The immigration officials who turned away the MS St. Louis knew what awaited the passengers in Europe. The RCMP officers who ran Operation Profundus knew they were maintaining lists of citizens for detention without trial. The Alberta Eugenics Board knew it was sterilizing people who did not need sterilization. History is not simply what happened. It is also what was known and what was chosen to be done about it. Canada, like every country, carries both the weight of what was done and the ongoing choice of what to do about what is known. The night is quiet around you now. The stories have settled like leaves after a wind. You have traveled far through time tonight, and the weight of what you have heard can rest beside you, not pressing down, but simply present. You are still safe. You are still warm. The breathing continues, in and out, slow and even, and the darkness is soft, and the night is long, and there is time. There is always time to think about what we have heard and what it asks of us, and what kind of country we might yet become. Let sleep find you now. Let it come gently. The day will return, and with it, the opportunity to carry some of this with you. But for now, simply rest, simply breathe, simply let go. The stories endure. Good night.